Welcome back, everybody. Today we're breaking down everything you missed from the latest Galactic News Network update, and to be clear, there's a lot to cover. From Rita's full kit reveal to new systems, story updates, and even an entirely new game mode, the patch is shaping up to be one of the more content-heavy ones that we've seen outside of a direct season update. So with that said, let's go ahead and get straight into it. So, the first thing we saw as we kicked off the live stream was basically what you've already seen from Rita, which is her animation. If you haven't seen the animation trailer already, it's pretty cool, and it gives her a first look at her overall aesthetic and theme. As expected though, she is a psionic justice character, and she's pretty much, I guess, based around time mechanics, even though, as we'll see a little bit later, it's not as rewindy or time-based as you'd think. Shortly after, though, we were greeted by G-Clef, of course, and then we saw more of Rita's breakdown after being introduced to some of her voice actors, some of her outside of combat details, which is fine. But then we also saw that the confirmed combatants alongside her are going to be Nia and Beryl, which is pretty cool. As you'll see with Rita's sort of kit, she does appreciate these two characters, especially with the way that she plays, which is great, of course, as you'll be getting more of these combatants if you pull on her. Now, as we actually break down how Rita works, she has quite a few different mechanics, and it's a bit confusing until you actually play around or mess with it yourself, so apologies in advance, but I'll try my best to actually explain how her kit works. So to start, it revolves around two main systems, Chronicle and Chronal Ascension. At the start of each turn, all Chronicle stacks are decreased, and for each one removed, she gains Chronal Ascension up to a maximum of 6 stacks. However, once she has Chronal Ascension active, she can no longer gain Chronicle, which creates this loop where you're converting one resource into another. Now, this resource is pretty interesting because it acts as her own version of AP effectively, and when you use her basic or unique cards, you can consume this special AP instead of her team's traditional AP source. Then, at the end of the turn, all the remaining Chronal Ascension is converted into, it's removed, and then it resets the cycle, and it forces you to manage your resources more carefully. Now, again, from a gameplay perspective, this leads into this sort of playstyle of her building Chronicle, converting it, and then spending it on high-impact cards. And as we'll see in a moment, there are a lot of different cards that she can use it on as we break down into her kit. So the first card that we'll talk about is Chrono Archon. Chrono Archon, of course, is the ability, or rather the card that allows you to actually start gaining Chronicles for the cost of a card. Cool, fine. The next card that we have is Time Axis Collapse. And this is more specifically a damage card, though as we'll see from the Epiphanies, there are different ways that you can manage this damage. Next, we have Future Decreed, and this is one of the main ways for her to bypass the heavy AP requirements in her deck that you'll see. But this card can definitely scale differently, or it can scale in a bunch of different ways. But it also allows you to synergize differently with different sort of DPS teams or with teams in general, which is pretty interesting for team building as it opens you up to many different possibilities, not just one specific DPS that Rita specifically synergizes with. Then we have Fate Imprint, which again is pretty cool. Fate Imprint is obviously, Fate Imprint comes from Chrono Circle. And Fate Imprint, in my opinion, is one of the more interesting, but still build-dependent mechanics of her kit. And depending on how you decide to build your deck, whether you're running exhaust or high-cost cards, etc., this card can also scale pretty differently, but it's also one of the cards or mechanics that'll get stronger the more that you're optimized, or the more optimized that your deck gets. So to take a look at a few of the epiphanies that we saw here, the first one that we have here is, if my video will load, is Chrono Archon. So a few of these epiphanies look pretty cool. Of course, I think having 3 Chronicle when Chronal Ascension is removed is pretty good. But as you see, there are various ways that you can make this card scale, or the way that you can use this card. Retain effects. there are obviously different DPS in the game that do different effects like this. 9 comes to mind in terms of exhausting, and even with characters like Tressa, who exhaust in general too, this is obviously a more skewed upgrade for her. But despite this all seeming to be more supportive focus at first, this character actually does a decent amount of damage herself, as you'll see with Time Axis Collapse and some of the other damage dealing abilities in her kit. So to start things off though, as you can see, some of the damage, or rather some of the scalings here, just give you a specific amount of damage herself, and with this you can increase, however, the damage of the next 3 attack cards of the unit, and this will be really nice, as we'll see later, as there are some attacks specifically from Rita that do a lot of damage. So being able to self buff, pretty cool. But something that you've probably noticed here is the high AP cost, which I myself was also pretty concerned with. But as you'll see, and as you're able to kind of see the bigger picture of her deck, a lot of these cards end up either being casted for free, or they don't really cost this amount, or the cost of these cards will be used for other features or for other reasons, like being able to draw more. That said though, what I personally found to be the most interesting was the change cost of all Fate Imprint cards to 4, alongside this some of these earlier cards, ones that increase the damage of her own or I guess her own DPS cards as well, including, or rather also, or while also including something like this second card here that reduces the cost to 1, and it also increases the damage amount by 30% for each 1 cost or lower card in hand, which does mean maybe you can stack her with characters like Serennial. We'll have to see. Now, the other card that we have is the Fate Imprint card, or rather the Future Decreed card. Apologies, I'm getting ahead of myself. And with the Future Decreed card, here we go. So the Future Decreed card, in my opinion, is one of the more interesting supportive cards that she has access to. And obviously this may feel somewhat similar to something like the Narjas, or one of these utility cards where you're able to obviously support the team. This first card in particular does remind me a lot of Narja's deck, with you being able to reduce the cost of certain cards and then activate a random number of cards here. However, this also even more specifically allows you to skew to the sort of DPS or deck that you're running, as some of these again will allow you to activate the cost of 3 cost cards. Sometimes you'll be able to activate 2 cost cards, and then of course if you also choose to use this Future Decreed upgrade at the end, you can also deal a decent amount of damage yourself too. These are not low multipliers, by the way. 300% damage to a random enemy may not seem like a nuke sort of ability by itself, but it reads that when a card whose cost is increased is used manually, 300% damage is dealt to a random enemy. This can be used on basically like a majority of Rita's kit, which means that this will start to do a lot of damage, though arguably because a lot of the cards in Rita's kit are unique based. I am guessing at the moment that there's a chance that Future Decreed will be something that you end up using to either, again, cast some of these cards earlier, or it'll be something that you'll end up duping and be able to of course spam out cards without much worry in terms of cost. And again, as a reminder, this does activate random attack cards, not just of her own, which I think is also interesting. And as we've seen from, or as we'll see in terms of team recommendation, they do allow you to also, or they do recommend you use characters like Haru. Now, after this, we saw the last cards here, which is the Fate Imprint, and these do actually do quite a bit of damage. The Chrono Circle Epiphanies in general, though, I think are they're again pretty, I guess, skewed to what you'd imagine from the previous Epiphanies. Some of them have retained, some of them are just generically useful. They create 3 Fate Imprints. Some of them allow you to exhaust, and some will also allow you to upgrade or be used as an upgrade, and you can draw certain cards. All of these again are fine, but when you take a look at, again, this Fate Imprint card, I think this is where the DPS aspect of Rita is quite interesting. Again, as you read here, this is a retain and exhaust card. It reads, however, that it's 120% damage for each cost of the card. Cool. And then increases the cost of all Fate Imprints in your hand by 1. And when the card leaves the hand, you change the cost to 2. Now, again, this doesn't mean that you will inherently have an insanely high amount of damage on this card by itself. But again, if you keep increasing the cost of this card, which you can do very easily through a lot of the epiphanies and through what we've talked about earlier from some of the cards, you can see this will start to do, or will start to add up in terms of damage. Again, to even add just from this, moving all the basic cards of your unit to hand, being able to increase the number of cost, or rather increase the number of cards that you draw, exhausting certain cards, and then creating fate imprints for the cost of each card. If you have cards that cost an extreme amount, including something like Teferi's 5 cost card, and you choose to or want to exhaust a card like that, even for a Chrono Circle, this is just one of the different ways, or one of the several ways that you can deal a lot of damage with this fate imprint. But next, we have to talk about her ego skill, which I think is pretty interesting too. By itself, though, this is an immediate 6 draw, or basically a 5 ego cost for a 6 AP draw, or rather 6 AP increase, which is already a pretty strong trade, and it ties directly into her ability to reduce costs and obviously enable bigger turns. But overall, honestly, this card is also pretty good, or rather this ego skill is also pretty good, because it increases the damage of the next card by 10% for each combined cost of cards activated during this battle, which again is a scaling card by itself, and is probably something that as you get later and later into a longer term sort of battle will obviously be more valuable. Now, in terms of her potential tree, we also got to see some of her effects, or what she has access to here too. Her potential tree, first and foremost, though, includes crit rate and crit damage, which to me signifies that she'll be more damage rather than just utility. And while we don't exactly, have every single detail right now, we do also know that the cards here, or rather the little effects that you'll see here, they do increase, or they do buff a lot of her damage-oriented aspects of her kit. As we move to something like here, you'll see that she gains 10% attack herself. And for the card that, or rather for the effect that we missed a second ago, which I hope I can get a screenshot of. Oh, okay. In any case, I'm pretty sure it is just more damage, but you understand, or you kind of understand the idea behind the upgrades. They're mostly supposed to be stat upgrades to buff the amount of damage that you do, especially in Rita's case. Now, as we move forward, of course, we should talk about the egos. The egos are pretty interesting. A lot of this, though, is pretty difficult to kind of visualize without understanding or just playing it yourself. This first card, though, reads that the time paradox cards receives an effect, and if Chronicle is decreased by 6, you will gain 8 instead. This again is pretty specific. It says you specifically have to have 6 decrease for you to gain 8. Again, this isn't super complicated, but you can see there's this skill card here that you have, and it decreases all Chronicle, and you gain Chronal Ascension for each decreased, and if 6 was decreased, you gain 8 instead. So basically, this is like a bit of math and management that you'll have to deal with, but obviously this is a nice increase. Of course, gaining 8 effective, basically 8 effective AP or Chronal Ascension is pretty nice, but of course it does require you to think a bit about the kit, or rather the deck that you're playing. Some of her other egos are also pretty interesting. Some of them will increase her damage. Some of them will add additional cards, or rather add some additional draw, or add some other cards to your hand. Some of them will also increase the amount of damage that you deal. Overall, though, I'm a huge fan of these egos, and again, since we do technically quote-unquote have access to these free ego manifestation upgrade materials from the shop, this doesn't feel super bad. But I do actually think that if you take a look at her E6, I think her E6 is maybe the most interesting of all, where you basically one time per battle increase the amount of AP that you gain by 6 instead of 1. And this also inflicts damage for each Chronal Ascension that you remove and are then using over one turn, which again is just free damage, and also a pretty good way, or not just a utility, but like a good damage and utility hybrid that adds quite a lot to her kit. Next, we got a bit of her animation in-game showcase, which I thought was pretty cool. There are animations here that are more time-based, and I understand it, but truth be told, I don't think this is super time-based. I get it, she has all the time-based things, but I thought we'd have like a rewind, and despite her also having a card called rewind, I thought we'd like go back in time and people would like lose their cooldowns and stuff, which I guess she sort of has, but it's not really quite the same. However, I do think in general, as we've seen and as we've kind of been shown through the damage of her kit, she isn't just a damage dealer or a support character by herself. She feels a lot like Narja or Tifera in that sense, but I actually think she's a bit, or can go a bit further, and as you'll see, she does actually end up dealing quite a bit of damage herself. This showcase specifically kind of shows a little bit here, but if you even take a look at something like this, people were commenting about how Haru didn't do a whole lot of damage here, and everyone's kind of curious why like her anchor shot did nothing. But then you take a look at how much damage she deals with Time Paradox and dealing damage herself, and yeah, I'll let the clip speak for itself. Okay, she gets her AP. And yeah. Again, now 8,000 isn't the most insane amount of damage in the world. We've definitely seen a lot of damage come out of characters like 9, but 8,000 damage on a character who's effectively supposed to, or you would imagine as a psionic character, is more leaning towards utility, especially with everything in her kit, is pretty crazy. That said, we do also have to talk about her best teams. Her best teams, though, are pretty straightforward. They are characters who have high EP costs. They allow her to draw. They allow her to discard. In some cases, they allow her, obviously, the ability to gain AP herself through Mika, or you could have infinite draw with someone like Ray and increase the damage of your kit. But something, of course, that you probably point out, or that you could point out in this case, is that you do have to basically have one of these high AP cost characters, including Haru or 9. I think both are likely pretty good too, especially with how specifically skewed they are, or skewed towards justice Rita specifically is. Otherwise, 9 is, of course, basically the goat of the current season, given that she is this order character, and all the bosses or all the enemies are kind of punishing multi-hit fights or multi-hit characters, and single hitting very high damage kits are instead what people enjoy or will appreciate or will do better with. Because of this, basically having Rita or Haru on your team at the moment is a no-brainer, though I think that there's probably a bit more cooking that can be done here. I'd imagine the characters like Narja can also be used, but even Tifera, who ends up being likely one of the better characters or better supports in general at the moment, are likely going to be her best recommended lineups. Though again, as a reminder, Tifera does also have a pretty high card in her deck too, if you choose to use it for the case of exhausting. But again, there are so many different variations for this character, so many builds that you can run on it, which obviously makes sense given how she's supposed to be quite versatile. Now, we also got a quick look at her partner, Ivy. This character, or rather, this partner looks specifically all juiced and buffing damage based. The passive itself, again, already does a pretty good job at buffing the damage that the combatant or the equipped combatant does herself. However, as you'll read, you do basically have to be a 2, 3, or 4 cost sort of character, alongside being a justice justice-based character too, in order to really take effect of this. But even from the ego skill 2, this increases the amount of damage taken from an enemy, or rather increases the amount of damage that an enemy takes from 2 cost or higher attack cards by 20%. For 2 cost, or rather for this cost, this is a pretty worthwhile partner, to be honest. Again, we'll have to wait and see exactly how much damage this ends up being, but with all this damage, and especially if you're playing one of these characters who wants to deal damage, this feels like it's going to do quite a significant, or be quite significant for the builds that have it. But even from just this partner, this is probably, to me, what started to kind of turn the wheels in terms of whether I want to see Rita as more of a DPS or more of a support. Because again, if you had a support card, or if you at least had a support partner who was more utility based, then I'd understand. But this more accurately, to me, at least kind of paints her more as a sub DPS, or even in some cases a main DPS, rather than a support who accidentally has damage in her kit. Now, moving on from Rita, there were other things that they've touched on, including updates to the story. We've also gotten things, I guess, like the updates to the environmental skill tree, which is also pretty nice. We didn't have much of it unlocked from the original skill tree that we had unlocked. I think we only had a few bits of this. But to add to this as well, they've also added a new God's Hammer mechanic, where now if you defeat specific bosses, you gain an additional God's Hammer. But as a quick disclaimer, you cannot have two God's Hammer pieces, and instead what this additional God's Hammer is used for is basically to reroll if you didn't like your initial God's Hammer. Now, there's another new system here as well called, or rather, wait, if I can find it. Is it? Where is it? Okay, I'm not exactly sure where it is, but there is now also the feature to combine the memory fragments, or the memory fragments in general. You'll just have to like listen to the way I describe it, but effectively this allows you to put together the resources from or rather the gear equipment, the upgrade materials, so you can combine them, which is pretty cool. But on top of this, we also have Memory of Ember, and this allows you Memory of Embers is what allows you to modify the effect of your God's Hammer. And I apologize for that. That's what we already mentioned. But there is now also a new retain sequence effect. Gosh, it is kind of hard to scroll through this. I apologize, guys. Okay, retain sequence is right here. Effectively, what this is that there's a new stockpiling sort of resource effect, which during turns that you can't spend everything, it'll smooth out your AP, or rather, it'll reward you for not using much of your AP, similar to that of stockpiling. It'll allow you to draw 1 and gain 1 AP once per battle. Now, finally, as we've kind of, and you've probably seen, there is also mention of the Core of Discord. This is effectively what I believe we had in Season 1, where it's like an extra fight or an additional fight. This, however, is only accessible after you complete Chapter 3 if you want to access it. And there's also, again, a bit of value or a bit of reward from this, which, of course, is the God's Hammer. Now, on top of this, they've also unlocked the supply store as well, which is fine. But there's also a skip option for the God's Hammer if you don't like the effect that you have. Finally, though, we have this new Monsters Arena, which is pretty crazy. This is, again, a full new addition to the game. It's effectively a separate system where you build teams using monster cards, and you, of course, don't need these monster cards in your deck by default. You'll select a team, you'll assign the collected cards, and you can try out all these different combinations. It has set effects kind of similar to, as they described, something like an auto battler or an auto chess sort of game. And it also has auto mode when you get into the game, which I think is also pretty cool if you're quite lazy. But yeah, pretty cool. Now, again, we've also seen the lobby animation for Rita, which I think is pretty cool. But, oh, here it is. The particles of memory merge. Yes, so this merge tool, I think, is pretty crazy. This is maybe one of the biggest gates right now if you're trying to upgrade or upgrade gear in general. However, they've also added additional things to the game, again, like the sub-story event. They've made improvements like improving the archive system. They've added a live broadcast link to the game, and there's also new events. But so overall, guys, this update brings a lot of content. Rita looks like a pretty unique and high skill ceiling character. She has a lot of resource management. The new systems add a lot of depth. And overall, in my opinion, I think the monster card arena thing is probably the most interesting, as I feel like monster cards in general are something that they kind of flubbed the introduction of at the start of the game, as people just kind of write them off now and no one really cares about the monster cards, though in some cases you could use them. But I feel like the general stigma is that people will not use these cards because they cost too much, and this is their way of reintroducing or kind of getting people a bit more comfortable or familiar with them. Anyways, though, guys, that's everything that you missed in the Galactic News Network. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.